Hi, it's Ileana. So today I'm going to be talking about the intricacies of accessing the Akashic records. The evolution of the process has been a very teaching experience for me because usually how I would access the Akashic records in sessions or on my own would be through a set of questions that the person who asks for the session, right? There's a set of questions you create to speak to galactic beings in the Akashic records or to learn information about galactic beings through a records representative who opens the records. So they don't like to be called records keepers, or basically. So you have to have permission to access Akashic records. It's always done by permission. And it's done by frequency. If you're talking to a specific Akashic records representative, you would need to know their name so they can open the records. Or you would need to know the name of the being whose records you're looking at, like yourself, your full name, to look at your own Akashic records. This process has been evolving into more of communicating with beings, seeing images, receiving information, writing things down, creating like a catalog of information, of sources of what the beings share freely and willingly as part of session work. But when you do these kinds of intense deep dive sessions, patience is needed. Sometimes one session may not be enough to complete an Akashic Records project or work, so it can take time to do the notes. It can take time to access the images, to render the images, to draw them, and having patience while that work is being done is so incredibly important, because the person who's accessing the Akashic records is doing their best to complete project work. And sometimes a lot of information is covered during sessions, so making sure your questions have a particular focus of interest that you're accessing in the Akashic records is very important, because you could go very deep in Akashic records. You can access a lot of information. If the Akashic records reader is good at what they do, they can talk to different beings in the Akashic records, the Akashic record representatives who open up the Akashic records. Part of the session could be with one being opening one set of Akashic records that they are connected to as a record representative, and then the energy switched to another being of a totally different frequency to access galactic or universal Akashic records. Another Akashic records representative accessing the records through the conduit of the Akashic records reader who's facilitating the session, but it's the being talking through them of a pure vibration. So a lot of information can come through in one session, and the focus of the questions is to make sure you get as much information as you can, but keep in mind that sometimes you may need more sessions if you have a lot of questions and you have specific project work that's going on. Sometimes Akashic records readings can be used for project work. If you're doing special things, this can work that way to access information. If you're writing books, if you're doing things you're looking for history on things, you're trying to learn about galactics, you're trying to learn about yourself, who you are as a living being, where you come from, your past lives, your questions will be indicative of what information can be found in the Akashic records. The more precise you are, the more organized you are, your outcomes of sessions will depend on that. The focus, the meaning of what information you're looking for, because the Akashic records are very vast. And again, sometimes Akashic record readers, when they connect to beings, they'll have notes, they'll make notes, they might have images of what the beings look like, depending on what you asked for your session type and other work projects. So it's possible to work with an Akashic records reader who is multi-talented, who can render images of what these beings, galactic beings, look like: multi-dimensional, extraterrestrial, interterrestrial, inner earth. There's many different beings of a positive polarity who the Akashic records reader can connect to and look in various different Akashic records, universal, galactic, whatever that is. It depends on their ability. Can they connect to the being's energy for those beings to open up the records to see what's there? Can they connect to the beings on a telepathic scale? Even before sessions, can they do project work for rendering things? Can they describe the beings, talk to the beings? It's really dependent on what the Akashic records reader can do and what their ability is and how far they can access Akashic records of different type. Whether it's a planetary Akashic record, a galactic Akashic record of other planets, not within the solar system, universal Akashic records of everything in creation, or a particular universe, when they access that information, it can take time to transcribe everything. It can take time to process the information, what it actually means, what the beings showed them, taught them, explained to them. So patience is needed for that process to take place correctly. If it's rushed, if it's disrupted, the frequency might be off. The information might be incomplete. So it's a process. It takes time depending on the Akashic records reader's ability and what they can do with what they're accessing and tapping into. Those are important considerations to take in when trying to work with an Akashic records reader. In the type of session you ask for, what you're trying to access in information about yourself, your own Akashic records, or other Akashic records of other beings. For personal stuff or for project work, it could be multivaried on what the process is. But what I've learned is that the word Akashic records keepers, the word keeper is not something that is used often. Some Akashic records readers do use that word and some don't. I don't use it. The beings I'm connected to don't use it. So it's just the Akashic records representative and the being's name. And they will give you a name. It might be not their spiritual name. It might not be even their how their name is pronounced. It's a name that accesses the Akashic records. And it's private. You don't say that name to somebody else. It's only used for the Akashic records session, in the session. So the amount of time you choose for your session really depends on how many questions you have, how deep your questions are, how focused your questions are on detail, what you're looking specifically in the Akashic records to ask the beings, to ask your higher self, to ask the records in general, whoever the Akashic records representative is. What you put into the input of your session depends on the output of your session and the focus and how many beings you plan to speak to during a session. If you have a 1 hour session, it could be like 5-7 questions. If you have 2 hour session, it could be like maybe 10, 15 questions, depending on your focus. You know, if you have like 40, 50 questions, it's probably going to be more than one session, more than a 2-hour session to answer those questions. And if you have something to show in your session, like visuals or something to ask questions about, that can take even longer to explain things, what you're asking the being to look at visually and explain. So that matters as well. I'm just explaining how these Akashic records work. These Akashic records reading sessions work in terms of it could be more simplistic session or it could be more complex session depending on what you're looking for to get out of it. And you know, how good you are with writing down questions, your ideas for sessions, and how good the Akashic Records reader is in facilitating the session and connecting to beings, connecting to the records, and retrieving information in the session. Akashic Records sessions should always be recorded, and you should always get a copy of the video. If you're doing special project work, if the Akashic Records reader is taking notes, is doing images for you, make sure you agree upon what's going on and why. And if you need a certain amount of time, make sure you build in the time for that, because that could be a whole project and how long it takes. And sometimes it's hard to say how long it will take depending on how much information is going into the work, into the project itself. If there's visuals connected to the notes, connected to descriptions of things, and if there's hundreds of images and hundreds of write-ups and like say close to 100 pages, that's going to take a lot of work, and patience is needed in how that is handled and how you do that work. Make sure you time it, make sure you realistically know what your project work is going to be like, because it can be intense work for how much information and ideas, creativities coming in, visuals. If you're working with a digital artist for these projects, or the Akashic Records reader is also a digital artist creating these visuals for you and connecting to the beings, creating descriptions, that can take up to a month to do, a couple of weeks, and that should all be put into consideration how those projects look like. And if you're doing this for the very first time, it is experimental to figure out how that works. And again, it needs time. So I'm just sharing these ideas of what could happen in that kind of a workflow, because I think people should know how Akashic Records work. You're accessing energy, you're accessing frequency, you're accessing information, you're accessing real live beings in the Akashic Records, their culture, their history, their planets, names, things like that. You're accessing your own Akashic Records of your current life, your past lives, your future information of who you might be in a future lifetime or something in the future. You could be asking questions about what soul family you're connected to, why you came with more than one family member into this lifetime. It could be things about the universe, about creation. It could be things about yourself or other beings. And all of it is connected to privacy, respect, honor. And sometimes the information you might ask in the Akashic Records could also be classified. So the answer could be classified, sorry, there's no access to this information, or be more specific, or ask a different question that might give you some information about something that is not classified but is acceptable. So sometimes answers will depend on what the question is and how far the question can be taken to be answered. Because sometimes things are classified, and we as Akashic Records readers respect that. If the beings say, or the Akashic Records reader representative who's opening the Akashic Records for you says it's classified, That means there's something in the information that is sensitive, that cannot be revealed, even in private or in public. And we must respect that if that happens. It's nothing against the Akashic Records reader or the representative, the beings opening the Akashic Record through the Akashic Records reader. It's just the info is classified, and so there's a boundary of how far you could go with accessing certain types of information. Always respectful, always communicative. What are the boundaries, guidelines? And the Akashic Records reader will always ask to see the questions of what you're planning for your session, so they know the general flow of the session. And again, how you create your session is dependent on what you're looking for. And if you have a lot of questions, if you have a lot of visuals you're exploring in the session, it could be more than one session. Honestly, sometimes it could be hard to tell until the session is actually done. And then you know if you'll need more time for a second session to gather your information through figuring out your questions, or, just updating the way you are going to design the flow of your session. So that's important to keep in mind. Think about the amount of time you book for a session, the amount of questions you have, how detailed you want to go. That all depends on what you're looking for. So I just wanted to share that, as I think this info is important at this time for people to know if they're learning about Akashic Records, learning about session work, learning about who they want to connect for them to do a session with for Akashic Records readings, what to keep in mind and be on the lookout for, and what are Akashic Records readers capable of doing, how far they can take a session, and what work they can do. This is just what I generally know about this practice and some protocols, and just what I've learned over the years of being in this field. Thank you so much.